So it's well known that the CIA's plans and propaganda tended to blow up in their face. But it's less commonly talked about how this happened to the Soviet Bloc as well. Famously, the Communist Party of the United States, which the Soviet Union funneled millions of dollars into, was effectively ran by the FBI. In fact, they were running so much money through it that the FBI was worried that they were running afoul of money laundering laws. But another instance is something that the right wing of the United States probably wouldn't want to brag about, and that's the anti-nuke movement. A very effective way that the Soviet Bloc was able to consistently hang on the West throughout the Cold War is that a lot of their actions, indeed most of them, seem to want to encourage conflict. Textbooks published in East Germany would highlight that this was done by ignoring the will of the people. So a very effective in that the Soviet Bloc had to the West was by positioning themselves as being the ones that were for arms control. This despite their own ever-increasing arms stockpile that was only being done in reaction to the West. But much like the CIA, the Soviet Bloc wasn't involved in the day-to-day operations of these groups. They treated them like a wind-up toy or a car on a bookshelf. They got them ready, let them go, and wherever they ended up, they'd be entertained. Because the most important work that would always be done would be by organic movements. Organic movements that weren't officially tied to them. But by the 1980s, this had become a problem. One that you can track the progression of in the music of Kraftwerk, of all things. Because in the Soviet Bloc, there was a distinction between the atom of war and the atom of peace. And in the West, the atom itself was the problem. And these movements had started to target the Soviet Bloc. The atom itself always held a special place in the Soviet Bloc. Nuclear energy came to the Soviet Union at a time that every single penny had to be used strategically because the Soviet Union had just been devastated by the Second World War. And nuclear energy was untested, unproven, and difficult to implement. Further, the Soviet Union already had ample resources in gas, oil, and coal, and could expropriate what was needed out of its satellites. East Germany in specific until 1953, when reparation payments were forgiven for reasons. But nuclear power could do something that the others couldn't. It could bring prestige and be situated close to where the power was needed, meaning that it didn't need to undergo expensive transport. The first Soviet nuclear energy reactor was approved 3 months before the Soviet Union tested their first atomic weapon. Then on June 27, 1954, the station at Obinsk was connected to the Moscow grid, becoming the world's first to generate grid power. At a time when fears of nuclear weapons were skyrocketing, the Soviet Union was the first on the market to the future. Soviet nuclear physicists also worked tirelessly to weave nuclear energy into visions of the bright communist future. Nuclear power was nicely compatible with earlier modernization drives, such as Lenin's electrification of the entire country campaign of the 1920s. The special status of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, what Soviet nuclear promoters dubbed the peaceful atom, forgive me, atomiyny, also fits seamlessly into emerging Cold War narratives of Soviet peaceful ambitions as opposed to those of capitalist aggressors. And oh boy, was the education in the Soviet Bloc focused on highlighting those capitalist aggressors. I've said before, one of the biggest gifts that the West gave to the Soviet Bloc was by having a military literally right on their border. Because it's hard to roll your eyes about fear-mongering when there are tanks and missiles literally a few miles away from you. History education in the 1960s highlighted how World War II had been far from the death of fascism, because those who supported it still existed. And textbooks that pointed into West Germany went further to reinforce how not only had the West continued the destruction from World War II, but they were trampling over the will of the citizens of West Germany to get there. This 1961 East German textbook showcased launch pads for nuclear missiles which threatened peace and extricated the West German government as warmongers who are afraid of the will of the people. And just what were those people feeling across the border? Well, they also had some questions about what was going on with the atom. Initially in the West, there were two movements that existed alongside each other, but weren't necessarily linked. The anti-nuclear weapon movement and the anti-nuclear power movement. Nuclear energy did hold a level of fascination over the world writ large. It was popular in the West for much the same reason that the Soviet Bloc was into it. It was a sign of progress. There actually were protests against nuclear power going all the way back to the 1950s in the West. But it wouldn't be until the 1970s that these movements actually started to gain some traction. Initially, what the West was concerned about was nuclear arms. And this was one of the major toeholds that the Soviet Union had into the West. The major rhetoric from the Soviet Bloc in sympathetic ears was that the Cold War had been the fault of the United States. Michael Parenti famously referring to the arms race as a chase for superiority. And the US had been the first to build the bomb, the first to use it, the first to continually threaten to use it. And popular culture had taken hold of this idea of America careening towards finding any reason possible to use it. To a segment of society which had come to view the Cold War as purely the fault of the United States, a school of historical thought known as the New Left, every American action was viewed through the lens of warmongering. Hell, this was the country that had articles written about how people would shoot their neighbors to keep them out of their fallout shelters. And it's actually debatable just how much of a hand the Soviet Bloc had in these movements. It turns out that people can be against the idea of nuclear weapons without needing to be paid off. It's known from declassified files, which I'm getting to, that they were involved in these movements, but the idea was already there. They just need to provide rhetorical backstopping along with some timely infusions of money to keep the idea rolling. In case you're wondering, this is also what the CIA tended to do with Western rhetoric. Meanwhile to all this happening, there's a growing green movement in the West that is very sympathetic to left-leaning causes. And I could get very technical talking about those, but there's something much more fun I can speak about to actually get us to those Stasi and KGB documents. And that's a little band from Dusseldorf. One of the most influential musical acts of the 20th century, and I will fight you on this, is Kraftwerk. It's not a stretch to call them the soundtrack of the Cold War in West Germany. And interestingly enough, they released a song that you can use to track Western changes of nuclear energy from one of fascination to horrific realization, radioactivity, which initially was hyphenated, Radiated. It was about radio waves. It asked people to tune into the melody discovered by Madame Curie. It was, as the East German state begrudged, in the air for you and me. Almost simultaneously as the song was being released, however, the anti-nuclear power movement exploded globally. In West Germany, the occupation of Ville turned fringe green movements into a national issue. In the United States, the 3 Mile Island incident occurred at the same time as an international scientific meeting on over West Germany. Picking up the successful and popular rhetoric of the anti-nuke movements, the green movements gained real political power heading into the 1980s by marrying the fears over nuclear disaster with the very real threat of nuclear war. Then Chernobyl happens. The radical shifting that this causes in West German society is reflected in an update to the song that Kraftwerk released in 1991, Radioactivity. No hyphen this time. The disasters at Chernobyl, Harrisburg, Sellafield, Hiroshima are mentioned by name. Further, the song's chorus clearly stated, "Stop radioactivity," as chain reaction and mutation led to a contaminated population. It was, after all, still in the air for you and me. Now, obviously, East Germany had ceased to be in that interim, but that very stark change, the one that married nuclear arms to nuclear power, was a existential threat to the Soviet Bloc. Because much like how radioactivity could spread across borders, so could ideas. I just realized I never actually mentioned that East Germany also began adopting nuclear power as the atom of the future. Over the course of the history of East Germany, 2 power stations were built, with a third planned. Nuclear power is seen as part of the path towards a peaceful future. Now, I've covered before how the East German government covered up the Chernobyl disaster, so I'm not going to go into full detail, but to recap, the East German government knew how bad radioactive fallout had contaminated the food and water supply in East Germany, and actively lied to their population about it. Even before reports from the West came in contradicting the state's line, people knew something was off, and once reports from the West started to come in, the East German populace, already at a precarious point with the state, simply stopped believing the state's lines. And with this comes other thoughts. If the state is lying to us about this, what else are they hiding from us? One of the places that the pushback of the state line occurs is in the Green movement. And their combining of anti-weapons appeals with anti-nuclear power appeals. Now, I had said earlier that we do have proof that East Germany and the Soviet Union were involved in the peace movements in the West. See, for example, this conversation memo written in 1983 by the head of East Germany's foreign intelligence, Markus Wolf, about a conversation he had with the deputy head of the KGB, Vladimir Khrushchev, discussing, well, the KGB's belief that NATO was about to launch a nuclear first strike. all die in the 80s. In it, Wolf states that they discussed how their hand could not be seen in any possible extremist actions by peace movements. In the current situation, that would not be expedient. Side note, it must be stated that Wolf would write another memo about how concerning it was that the Soviet Union was so obsessed with the idea that NATO was about to launch a nuclear first strike, as there was no actual evidence for this. He thought the Soviet Bloc was trying to create a problem that didn't actually exist. And the anti-weapons push from the beginning had grown strong roots in East German society. In fact, a neat part of East Germany's criminal code made it illegal to launch wars of aggression. I have thoughts on that could be fleshed out to a full video, but that's for a different time. Flash forward to the post-Chernobyl world, however, and the Green Movement rhetoric from the West had now come into East Germany. Instead of the KGB and the Stasi discussing how they can't be seen influencing peace movements in the West, there are now desperate memos being written about Western influence groups in East Germany. This 1989 memo from the KGB to the Stasi warns about actions that will be taken at East German power plants, aping the very successful actions of the movements in the West. In particular, it highlights how foreign radio stations are broadcasting into East Germany with instructions to discredit nuclear power stations in the Soviet Union. Further, that groups within the Soviet bloc are attempting to establish contact with green movements in the West, and that it is vitally important to discover the links between green movements and the enemy secret services. The very thing that earlier that decade the Soviet Union had said they couldn't be caught doing. That's the thing about toys. Sometimes they fall off the shelf. Here's the thing. There were probably plenty of points in this video where you went, well, they're not wrong. And yeah, there's a reason why the best quote-unquote propaganda is usually just literally going, so this is literally what happened, no embellishment. Green movements existed and still continue to exist without the support of the Soviet bloc. People can indeed support or be vehemently against something without corruptive outside influence. Much like how that outside influence, however, can sometimes blow up in your face. Could I expand more on that thought? Probably, but I'm recording this at the beginning of 2025, and you know the world you live in.